bring receipts then. Like, oh, you just feel that way? Not a great criticism of a book. So he didn't decorate himself into a big cake. If I was in charge of the Capitol, I would have developed a much more efficient system. Hey, hello. Today I am going to be doing like reacting to 1-star reviews of some of my favorite books. Now, disclaimer, guys. I haven't read a lot of these books in years, so I do kind of wish I was coming into it with these books like fresher in my mind to react to them better. But I don't want to spend like a month reading all of these books again. So we'll see how I think about it, what I think about it with my old memory. This is for the color purple. Stuff I don't like. Let's start with the first page. A graphic description of child grape. I don't want those detailed images in my brain, but there you go. I suppose that without this sensationalist start, this book wouldn't have gotten the attention that it did, so the author knew what she was doing. For me, the added detail lessened the impact. I think that this is fair because I have been multiple times while reading books shocked by the fact that I just had no clue there was going to be like a graphic rape or child grape scene, and I didn't want to hear about that, you know. And that is like what I have told people when recommending the book. It's like, this is a really good book. It starts with a graphic scene, you know. So I think that that's fair, that if you don't want to read that, if you don't want to hear that, I understand why that would like dissuade you. Saying that the detail lessened the impact, I don't know. I don't remember it being horribly. I mean, it was pretty, it was graphic in the sense that I think that the whole point of it was to be very swaying, because what you're hearing in the color purple, it's written through like journal entries and then later letters. So in the beginning of this, it's like a child's journal entry. I think she's writing to like God, and she's pretty much describing what happened to her. And I think it was detailed in the sense that it's not like, I don't think you got like very specific details, but it was kind of in the way where it was written like how a child would describe these things. And I think that it was more disturbing than even if it was just like a very like if you just wrote down all the details. I think it's more disturbing to write about like how a child would describe being assaulted. But I think that would heighten the impact and not lessen it, because why would a vaguer description of it have less impact? You know what I mean? Shug. She was the most detestable female character in the book. She is meant to serve as the moral compass of the novel, but seems to only be motivated by her own selfishness. At one point, she takes off on a fling with a 19-year-old just because she can. She goes through partners and spouses quicker than I change my furnace filter. She has children and lovers strewn about the country. Very few details are given of the hurt she has caused her own children because of her free-spirited lifestyle. Don't get me started on her justification for her actions by creating a god of her own imagination. I think that is a misunderstanding of what her character is supposed to be. I haven't read it in years, but from my memory, I wouldn't have said that she was supposed to be a moral compass of the book. I think that she was supposed to be very opposite to who Celia was, you know? Where Celia would never, she would never fight back about anything. She couldn't stand up for herself. She couldn't like take her life into her own control. And I think it was supposed to represent like this very like swing of the dial, where you have this one character who like is suffering so much from not being selfish and not doing anything for herself, and then this other female character who just embodies like selfishness, saying that she was one of the most detestable female characters, and then pretty much just saying she had a fling with a 19-year-old and then she kept changing partners and spouses. It's kind of giving like condemning women for their for being free in their sexuality, you know what I mean, and saying, well, she's a detestable female character because she had a couple of spouses and she kept getting remarried, you know. And I don't remember her being again, I haven't read it in a minute, okay? I don't remember her being the most likable character on earth. And I think that this is something that is going to keep coming up in a lot of these reviews, but I think sometimes the point is not for the character to be likable. I think a lot of people struggle with that, where they feel like if the character is not likable, it's like this horrible, horrible thing. And I'm just kind of over that. You know what I mean? Misandry. I had to look up the opposite of misogyny in order to find the description of the way that the men are portrayed in the book. Child rapist, wife beater, wannabe wife beater, and drug dealer. The only positive portrayal of a man, Odessa's husband, is barely given a mention. Yes, there's plenty of evil in this world, but to have it defined by gender is a bit petty. And of course, it's not just African American men either. The author goes out of her way to show that African men and white men are equally despicable. That is the point of the book. I think it's kind of crazy to take a book that is revolving around how, you know, the way that men mistreat women and like how that impacts their lives. I feel like that is so much what this book is about. At least that's what I got away with it. And I think it's crazy to say, well, this book isn't very good because they just keep portraying all the men as bad when that's what the book is about. You know what I mean? This book, and that's the thing too always about these things, where I feel like you can never just state like, hey, this book is about a girl who got, you know, like sexually assaulted as a child and then abused, like pretty much like sold off to her husband while she was still very young and then abused by that husband. But hey guys, this is misandry. We're just, there are evil things that happen in the world, but just portraying as a man thing, that's bad. Like, the point of the book is to talk about those things. You do not need to sugarcoat. Like, if we're having a conversation about women being victims of childhood assault and abuse and how women are abused in relationships, and we do not need to sugarcoat it by being like, oh yeah, guys, you know, women have hit a man before. We don't need to sugarcoat it by saying, oh, women can do those things too. It's not just men who are evil. Like, I think we can all understand that in the world, that women have never not done anything bad before, without needing to put it in a book about that subject. Sorry. It really rubs me the wrong way, because it's like, if you don't want to read a book about how women are victims of these things, don't read it. But don't tell me the book is bad because it's about the thing that it's about. You know what I mean? And I think also, you know, I would say that by the end of the book, the characters have quite a different change in them. You know what I mean? And to say that it's just a misandrist is to overlook the actual like character growth that the characters have. And the son, who is like the wannabe wife beater in this situation, right? he has a good relationship with his wife, but then he wants to feel like a man. So he tries to beat her to make her submit to him, because without her submitting to him, he doesn't feel like he's performing his role as like a husband or as a man. And he's pretty much just trying to copy how his father treated like Celia. And I think that to just say, well, it's just misandry, is to completely overlook like what his whole character is trying to say. You know, his whole character isn't just saying wannabe wife beater. Like, it's a discussion on how if we frame masculinity as like making women submit to men, then you have this guy who loves his wife and who like their relationship was good, but who doesn't feel like he can be a husband without hitting her. You know, I think that that is an interesting conversation to have, and to boil it down to like misandry feels kind of crazy to me. And again, saying the only positive portrayal of a man, Odessa's husband, is barely given a mention. So she doesn't portray all men as like being evil. You do in the book have a good man, but the book isn't about that. You know what I mean? It's revolving around women and women's lives. You know what I mean? It goes back to the same thing where it's like, you can't talk about a woman experiencing, you know, being a victim of these things without having to sugarcoat it with like, oh, but there are some good men and there are some evil women. I don't think that needs to be said to have a conversation about women experiencing assault and abuse. Okay? His fourth point is family. Seriously, these people switch partners like they're square dancing. At one point, you have an ex-wife moving back with her husband to help raise his current wife's children because wife 2 took off to follow her dreams. You need a flow heart to keep track. You need a flow chart. He didn't put chart. You need a flow chart to keep track of who belongs to who. Maybe that's a personal taste thing. I feel like I've read a lot of books that have like complex family, you know, like things going on, and it can be confusing sometimes, but I didn't have trouble keeping track of who was with who, and I don't really see like, is having the subject of the book be about these complex relationships like a problem. Like, he's saying it like it's a bad aspect of the book to say, oh, they keep switching partners. But like, that is what the book is discussing. Do you not want the book to be discussing it? Would you rather have, I mean, it's one thing to say, hey, it's not really something I care about reading, personal taste, but it's like, you're not saying that it's like a bad description of it or that it's a bad portrayal of it. You're just saying that you don't like that it's happening in the book. Number 5, it's personal taste, but I can't stand narration through letter writing. Fair enough. Okay, and then he has stuff he likes. I'll just read the whole thing. Walker actually did a great job portraying Celia's developing independence. It was rewarding to see her develop self-reliance and individualism. It's just too bad that what should have been a fantastic story about a woman overcoming enormous odds to make a better life for herself is marred with such ham-fisted insertions about feminism, lesbianism, atheism, etc. It became a bit too silly just how many progressive tropes could be squeezed into the story. I laughed out loud when she managed to somehow insert a jab at Western imperialism. It was just too much. Yeah. Kind of crazy to say. that it's too bad to have a story about a woman overcoming enormous odds to make a better life for herself being inserted with feminism. That is what the book is about. And especially at the time, to have a conversation about a woman getting her independence, not relying on a husband, moving in with her girlfriend, those ideas are so insanely tied to feminism. And I think that this is an issue I have a lot when people talk about feminism, or they put down feminism and they say, well, you know, it's this feminine, ham-fisting feminist ideas and progressive tropes. The idea of a woman overcoming her, like, abusive relationship with her husband is so ingrained with feminism. Tell me how a book taking place in 1909 about a woman who is finding the confidence in herself to leave her abusive relationship and find herself, how that cannot be tied with feminism. And then it's saying, well, it's ham-fisted with lesbianism. So the thing you don't like about the book is that there are lesbians in it. Is that what it is? That's always how I feel whenever content is made. I felt similarly about Arcane, where people would say, oh, these progressive ideologies, we're being forced down our throat, lesbianism, because there is a gay couple. I don't see how that's any forcing of anything. They just exist in a piece of media. Stupid. Okay. The missionary activity in Africa was a fascinating narrative. Walker did a fantastic job with the subtle comparisons between African society and Southern Black society. Okay. I was going to let this pass with 2 stars, but I had to take a star away when I learned that the author's bigoted refusal to allow her book to be translated into one specific language. I know it's bad form to allow an author's personal views to affect a book review, but this just irritated me. I didn't know anything about that. Wait, let me Google it. Guys, you won't believe what it is. That's kind of crazy. Sometimes it just feels like nothing ever changes. Okay. Snowflower and the Secret Fan. Let's read the review, okay? I had high hopes for this book, but ended up feeling deflated and disappointed. 2 aspects of the book were interesting: descriptions of the practice of Chinese foot binding and an exploration of nushu, the written language Chinese women developed to communicate exclusively with each other. Unfortunately, the book also has 2 major problems: a boring story and the use of cheap gimmicks instead of complex characterization. The story deals with 2 girls who are matched as old sames, sort of a best girlfriend relationship that is meant to last for life. Unfortunately, the story of their friendship is just not compelling, and I kept feeling like the author missed the opportunity to tell a really interesting story within the context of the world she creates. Aside from being boring, the worst sin in fiction, I was also disappointed with the way she handled the intimacy of friendship between 2 women, using what I call the cheap and easy Hollywood method for showing intimacy. In other words, she introduces sexual elements to show us just how close these 2 women really are, rather than really taking us inside the complex world that the relationship between the 2 best girlfriends. I thought it was really shallow treatment of the deep subject. It was hugely disappointing. Don't recommend it. I think it's interesting that they say that the female friendship, they keep saying that it uses cheap gimmicks to display it, which I would disagree with. And it says that they're using intimacy to show it, sexual elements to show how close the two women really are. I wouldn't really say that happens that much. I really don't. I think that there's one scene when they're supposed to be like around teenagers where they're like laying together in bed and they are like taking water and like writing the letters from their language on each other's backs and being like, what letter am I writing? And I think that that's the closest it gets to having like sexual intimacy between the women. There's definitely a lot more talk about sexual intimacy between the women and their husbands. And I think more so like the way that she talks about Nushu, it is a language that only women knew, that for them to communicate with each other without men knowing. And a part of the whole like writing on the back thing, you could see it as the sexual intimacy. And I think that there is a part of that that I would agree is about sexual intimacy. But also it's about the language. They're writing on each other's back using their language. I think it's about that also is showing that that connects them and that, you know, there's intimacy with that, you know? So here's the second review. Different person, different review. I'm getting a little tired of the female friendship genre that seems to pervade contemporary literature these days. While there are some better written examples of this category, many of them seem to be written with the agenda of extolling the virtues and possibilities of close female friendship, perhaps as an alternative to traditional romance novels. Often, I feel that these authors are so anxious to idealize the close bonds between two women that they spend less time actually allowing these bonds to develop in a convincing way. Their characters remain undeveloped as well, leaving the reader with an overdone, unconvincing, and ultimately shallow storyline. This book is no exception. The writing is not bad, and the historical cultural context leads to some interest to what would otherwise be a truly boring novel. However, the characters were hollow, and their friendship and subsequent estrangement left me cold. I was so unenamored that I found myself wondering at the authenticity of the historical setting. How accepted were these ritualized female friendships, and did they really take precedence over the marital bonds at the time? A wife exchanging bed with her visiting sworn sister as opposed to her husband. I don't claim to be an expert on this period of Chinese history, but it seemed inconsistent with the little I know of the inferior status of women at this time and place. Given the author's general agenda, I couldn't help but wonder how many of the contextual details she colored in order to serve her purpose. Perhaps may this be an excuse by poetic license, but if it had been a better book, I would probably not be engaging in this cynical line of thought. The really good historical novel I've read were so convincing that it did not occur to me to question their authenticity. I think the first thing I would like to say is that it's interesting that quite a big portion of this review is talking about how, well, is this even historically accurate? But then the reviewer themselves admit that if the book was more enjoyable to them, more convincing, they wouldn't really bring it into question or care if it wasn't. And I think that that is interesting to say, well, from what I know as somebody who doesn't know the history of China, no way this could have happened. But also, you know, if I liked the book better, I wouldn't have cared if it was or not. I just think that that is a crazy take, and it's a crazy thing to write down. To say, like, both in the same paragraph that you don't actually know anything about the culture, you don't have enough like, they're not saying, oh, I actually found evidence that this wasn't true and that she like embellished. He's saying that, well, I didn't like the book enough that I think she did, you know? But then to say also that if he liked it better, he wouldn't have cared. So do you care about historical accuracy, or do you just care about how convincing somebody can write a book? So then talking about the whole female friendship genre and how it's, what did he say? Many of them seem to be written with an agenda of extolling the virtues and possibilities of close female friendship, perhaps as an alternative to traditional romance novels. Okay. I think it's interesting that he compares it, saying that it's supposed to be an alternative to romance novels, when why would that be? You know, there are so many interesting books to have and interesting stories to tell. And just because a story is focusing on two women's relationship instead of a marital or romantic relationship doesn't mean it's trying to replace it. I find it very odd that the writer, the review, immediately jumps to an alternative to a traditional romance novels. Why do you think it's trying to replace it? And especially saying that, oh, in these days, it's become so big. But I feel like romance novels are literally so huge right now. Like, I think it's like the biggest genre ever is romance novels right now. This wave of books that more closely talk about women's friendships is not trying to replace romance novels. It's a completely different genre, and just because there is a big wave of it doesn't mean it's trying to replace anything. I find that take so very odd. And I feel like that's the thing about this review, is that all his claims, like, he's making kind of big claims in it, but then, like, based on nothing. Like, he's like, I feel like this author might not really know, history, and their history is inaccurate. Bring receipts then. Like, oh, you just feel that way? Not a great criticism of a book that you feel like it might be inaccurate, but that you don't actually know. That's odd. That's crazy odd. And it's the same thing with this, where it's like, I feel like it's trying to be an alternative to romance novels. Okay, where are the receipts? Where are they? Because you can make a claim like that all you want, but it's not like a good argument for why a book is bad. And again, it's okay that you didn't like it. Like, I think this is the same with the other one, where it's like, oh, I found it boring. That's fine. You can find a book boring. You don't have to like them all. You don't have to like the subject matter. It could just not be for you. But I'm not going and watching like a bromance movie where it's about, the boys and brotherhood, and then I'm going, guys, they're trying to replace the traditional romance novel. This story about two men's brotherhood, they're trying to replace the traditional romance novel. That's stupid. I can just say, hey, it's not for me. I feel like I didn't really address, I feel like it's saying that it was underwhelming, and that that the female friendship wasn't like portrayed well. I don't think we read the same book. I think it's interesting the way it's portrayed, because we're not supposed to believe that they're like really close, because we're like really getting close to the characters. It spans over a long, like, pretty much they're like, since they're little girls to the one lady like being elderly. And the way that we're supposed to see them being friends is through that understanding of like growing up with somebody. And not like, I think that like different books that function in different ways, you are going to get connected to the characters differently. I don't know, where you have this book that spans over like somebody's entire lifetime, the way that you are getting to know the characters are different than a book that you are getting to know the characters through like day-to-day conversations. So I understand why some people might feel like it wasn't, like the relationship wasn't well like developed. But I think that it was just developed in a different way that not everyone may like. That's what I think about it. And I think the thing about it too is that the thing about it that is great about the book is that it is a complex look at that female relationship, not just between the two girls, but how female relationships were at the time a lot, where, you know, the mothers were very cold to their daughters to prepare them for them eventually, like, never seeing them again. And then the mother-in-laws were very cold to the daughters, almost like as a sort of like revenge almost, where it was like this culturally accepted thing that it's like just always being rude to your daughter's wife. Very boy mom, okay? Very boy mom. And about how so much about the book is revolved around how their relationships with men impact how well they can live, but that their most cherished and most delicate relationship is like between these two women. And I think that that's kind of beautiful, you know, and I think it's talking about the misogyny, and it's talking about, you know, how women were seen as an accessory, you know. Not the point of the book wasn't just supposed to be this like idealized, he says, I feel like these authors are so anxious to idealize the close bond between two women. But that's not even what the book is about. I mean, the book, they had, I guess spoiler, but they end up having a very bitter, like, almost end to their relationship because of these, like, societal structures that they put up for them and how you're supposed to act and what you're supposed to do and all these things. And it really impacts their relationship, and it ends up not really being a great relationship at the end of it. And that is so much more interesting. Hunger Games, far too unrealistic. I find it impossible to accept this world. It wasn't because it was a nasty place, but because it wasn't believable. The Capitol puts on these Hunger Games and sacrifices countless children in the process. I mean, what? Children? Why would the Capitol do this? If I was in charge of the Capitol, I would have developed a much more efficient system. Sure, buddy. I'd have fixed the game so that the leaders of each district were sacrificed each year. That way there would be no one left to lead an uprising against the Capitol. And those left in the districts wouldn't have the courage or reason to lead an uprising. They'd want to keep their heads down because they would be sacrificed next if they too led a rebellion. Problem solved. The Capitol rules the district in oppressive peace. So he has another point, but let's just start with this. It's crazy work to say that if you were in charge of the Capitol, you would have developed a more effective system. And also being like, children, why would they kill our children? As if, like, we aren't, like, so much more likely to be, like, sympathetic to children and care more about their harm. Like, we are so attached to our children, and we are so attached to, like, the suffering of the young, that the whole point of the games is not just to kill off the most, like, the people who are doing the uprising. The point was to instill fear. And if we can agree as a society that, like, we see the harm of children as being one of the most despicable things you can do, then it makes sense that if you want to instill fear, you want to harm children. And I think, and to be like, well, they wouldn't want to start a new rebellion because they would be scared of being sacrificed next. The whole point is that you kind of don't know who is doing the rebellion. Like, if the Capitol just knew all of the people who were starting a rebellion and who were, like, trying to stand up, yeah, that would be so easy if you knew all the people, you know? But I feel like that is the whole point of Plutarch's character, is that, like, he's Capitol, but he's, like, such a leader of the rebellion. Sure, if you find out that he's doing it, you kill him. But, like, that's beside the point, though. Because the cruelty of sacrifice is also too far-fetched. The residents of the capital are vain and greedy, but vain and greedy is a long way off from sadistic and brutal. I found it difficult to accept that in the capital, where there wasn't streets filled with violent protesters trying to save the lives of these kids, it just didn't work for me. The children are far too accepting and almost stoic when they're selected. I would go kicking and screaming. Their families just watch them go and accept. Then they rebel later. Idiots. The children also don't seem to be that afraid. They may have become used to the process, but surely the horror of the situation would lead to panic attacks and breakdowns. So I sort of understand the view of this, but I think it's also because the book is being told from the perspective of Katniss. Like, you might not see the kids having breakdowns and panic attacks in their own individual rooms, you know, like before the games or whatever. You know, we only know it from Katniss's perspective. So I think, guys, not the fly. Did you see the fly? I think that there are certain things that we just wouldn't see. And I feel like a lot of people in the Hunger Games world have a problem with that. I feel like a lot of people like to know everything. But we are only seeing the world through Katniss's perspective. You see her having her own breakdowns and her own panic attacks, you know, like when she's like having those nightmares about becoming an AVOC. We are not going to see them all freak out because she wouldn't have known about it. I'm sure this review was probably made before her other books released. They do talk about this in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, where they talk about how people were kind of like, is this just like justified for what they did? And how did the society get to a point where they overlook it and enjoy it? You know, and that is what a big part of the Songbirds and Snakes is about, is like, how as a society do we get from like just being like normal about it and seeing it as wrong and seeing it as horrible to the point where we don't care? You know, I think that there are a lot of horrible things that happen in our world that we look over. Then there's the games themselves. The whole thing is recorded by invisible cameras. There's a whole world of wrong with that. It seems to me like Collins wrote herself into a box and the only solution she could come up with is, I know, I'll make the cameras invisible. Then there's the idea of Peeta's camouflage skills. Basically, Collins suggests that Peeta was a baker and decorated his cakes artfully, despite the district being in poverty. He can then camouflage his entire body and the surroundings of the areas using said cake decorating skills. Now, that was plain stupid. I don't think she thought these ideas through enough. Invisible cameras. Again, I don't remember. I know that the movie, they like had it in the tree and stuff. And I don't remember if that was ever in the books. I think, again, is it that she said that the cameras are invisible? Or was it that Katniss was not supposed to be able to see them? Because again, we're seeing this from Katniss's perspective. I don't know if it's technically that, oh, they just have invisible cameras, or it was just supposed to be hidden enough so that Katniss couldn't see them. You know what I mean? Like, she wouldn't know where the cameras are. She wouldn't know how they're, like, covering up the cameras. And that makes sense that she, from the districts, wouldn't know that if we're seeing it through her eyes. She could have went into detail about how the cameras are made, but would that have made sense with how this story is being told from Katniss's perspective? I don't think so. I feel like a lot of times people criticize Hunger Games for certain details about how the world functions not being like in depth enough and us not understanding it. But the story is being told through Katniss's perspective. She wouldn't know those things. So there's that. The cake camouflage thing. This is like very, I think it's like one of the things you hear the most where people are like, that is so ridiculous. And I do agree to a degree. I don't think it's not ridiculous to say that he decorated his cakes so well that he's like perfect in camouflage. But also, didn't he just put a bunch of mud and dirt and grass on top of him? I don't think it really could have been that hard. And also, like, the idea is that it's like, oh, well, he's better at it because he has like artistic abilities. But that there was an actual camouflage like class thing when they were training for the games that he probably learned the skills from. I think the idea is, I think it's very, I think the idea is less heavy-handed than a lot of people make it seem, where it's like, well, he can just decorate himself into a big cake and nobody will notice, you know? Okay, well, that's the video.